from St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.
For the first time since she was elected to her post in 2016, Tammy Duckworth is part of a Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate. And now the Illinois Democrat is hoping to use her newfound power to provide minority communities with environmental justice. Duckworth talks with St. Louis Public Radio's Eric Schmid and the We Live Here team on the latest episode of Politically Speaking. So let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
We have to talk about things that matter to people.
I've tried to bring that same aggressive iconoclast style with me to the United States Senate.
I think my district is a model for the state.
We put Missourians first.
You just kind of have to find the common ground with people.
I believe that this district deserves someone who represents their values.
After I came back to St. Louis, I started thinking that I could have a bigger role on the change that I wanted to make.
Hi, everybody. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio and the host of Politically Speaking. What you're about to hear is a collaboration between St. Louis Public Radio's Metro East reporter Eric Schmid and Jialing Yang and Lauren Brown of We Live Here. The trio interviewed U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth about environmental legislation that she's sponsoring in Congress's upper chamber. You can catch a We Live Here episode about how Duckworth and Congresswoman Cori Bush are pushing for environmental justice bills this week on stlpr.org or wherever you get your podcast. But for now, here's the conversation with Duckworth in its entirety.
How does the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021, which you recently introduced with Representative Cori Bush and Senator Ed Markey, differ from or build upon previous environmental justice legislation?
Well, what it does is that it builds on a lot of the other environmental justice legislation, but it also, the whole thrust of it is to really recognize environmental justice as a civil right. So, for example, one of the things that it does is that it amends and strengthens the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits discrimination based on disparate impacts and overturns a court case. So, you know, what I'm trying to show is that that's new is that this is a civil right and that we are infringing on people's civil rights when we allow them to be discriminated based on access to a clean environment. It also builds on existing legislation like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act by explicitly adding language that says that you have to consider cumulative impacts when you make a permit decision. So when, you know, in the past, under the Clean Water Act, somebody could apply for a permit and, you know, to do something, right? And I don't know, build a new jetty, whatever that is. Under the Clean Water Act, they have to ask for a permit. Those were considered in a single one permit at a time, not on the cumulative effect. So you could actually have what happens in these Black and brown communities and poorer communities in particular is you have permit after permit after permit is granted, and cumulatively they add to significant environmental pollutants, say, toxins in the atmosphere that then results in high rates of childhood asthma. But if you only look at it one permit at a time, it doesn't seem like very much. It also, again, strengthens existing legislation and executive orders. It codifies the Clinton administration's environmental justice executive order by creating a working group to ensure compliance and enforcement and to develop a government-wide strategy so that it's not just something that the EPA worries about, but in fact, the Department of Defense should worry about environmental justice as well. So should the Department of Commerce, so should the Small Business Administration. It should be a whole of government approach to environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And then so there are other things in there as well that really builds on existing, builds on existing legislation, strengthens executive orders, but then also brings this new attitude of this is a civil right and we need to recognize it as such.
So that's part of the Environmental Justice Act, some of the existing updates to existing law. What are some of the important additions that the Environmental Justice for All Act makes? I know that there are some grant programs or many grant programs in there. Can you talk about those too?
Sure. So there's one that is funds programs to study potentially harmful products marketed towards women and girls of color, for example. You think of hair products as an example. looks also at things like skin lightening creams and things like that. Just when you target a particular subset of our population based on their race, we need to make sure that there's health equity there. It also provides programs that would ensure more equitable access to parks and the outdoors, so that there is outdoor access to all. And this came to me in two different things brought this to my attention. One, as a wheelchair user, I have a hard time accessing outdoor spaces, especially national parks and the like. And the national parks are currently going through a process of making them all wheelchair accessible. They've not all been that way. The other is in Chicago, there was a study that came out about 18 months ago that said that Chicago, with a wonderful lakeshore, on average has one day a year when the lakeshore beaches would be shut down due to poor water quality. And so if you're up north near the Magnificent Mile or some of the wealthier suburbs up north, you may have one day a year when that beach might be shut down. But if you're on the south side of Chicago, which is a largely Black community, they have an average of 39 days a year where that beach is shut down. That's not fair. And so the bill includes programs that will ensure more equitable access to parks and the outdoors. And then there are also environmental justice grant programs for research, education, and projects to address environmental and public health issues.
So these bills are certainly historic, but sometimes people aren't aware of the deep history of Black-led environmental justice efforts. Can you tell us how Hazel Johnson's legacy inspired you to start the Environmental Justice Caucus in the U.S. Senate?
Well, this is one of these things that I really didn't know about until I started meeting and talking with environmental justice activists, and they talk about how it's really individuals who stood up and said this is not right at a time when they may not even have had basic civil rights as persons of color. We're also arguing that this is part of civil rights and this is part of justice as well. Our new head of EPA, Mr. Regan, is done this from his home state of North Carolina as well. That's why I'm so pleased that President Biden nominated him to be the new head of the EPA. This whole idea that environmental justice is something that is worth fighting for, just like civil rights, and that it is a component of civil rights, was something that was really eye-opening to me. And it's why I really came up with this idea of starting the Environmental Justice Caucus in the Senate.
Turning to some specific examples, for the past few years, you've been advocating on behalf of the residents of Centerville, and that community will fold into Cahokia Heights later this year. Mm-hmm. For some of our listeners who may not know, what is the crisis that Centerville residents have been experiencing for decades? And I'm wondering if you could also explain how that is an example of environmental racism too.
Yes. So what happened in Centerville? This is a decades-long process. It used to be a much more diverse area of Illinois, but over the years we've had white flight happen. So it is now largely an African-American community. And what has happened over the years was from the previous generations, whenever decisions were being made at City Hall to upgrade basic infrastructure in the community, they upgraded the wealthier parts of town first, and really left the what has become the largely Black and brown portions of the town without being upgraded. One of these things is the sewer system. And so when they got new pumps, new sewer system, when they had made any type of upgrades, it went to the wealthier portions. And now, after decades of this, we now have a situation where the town community, the largely the poorer sections of town, and now largely the whole town, those portions where people of color live, have, anytime it rains, there's raw sewage that actually backs up into people's homes, and you can see toilet paper in people's front yards, and it's just literally decades of neglect and basically racist policies and investments in infrastructure repairs and infrastructure upgrades. They've now banded together with several other communities within the region that are going to be called the Cahokia Heights community. And I've been working with them to try to help them win some federal grants in order to upgrade the sewer systems. I've been talking to our governor to try to get some state funding as well to come in and to really take some of these decision making out of local policymakers and have it be a really independent review of where do you really need this fixed. But basically you get to a point now, decades later, where you have a real disparity in something as basic as, access to a sewer system that works.
What's at stake if communities of color continue to bear the brunt of intentional environmental injustices? For example, a group of Chicago activists were on a hunger strike about a recycling plant moving their operations from a mostly affluent white neighborhood to a southeast side, mostly Latino neighborhood. How has structural racism contributed to this controversy?
Well, this is one of the things that this is the permitting issue. So the white neighborhood said, hey, we don't want this. We don't want you to be, doing this work here. And so they denied the permit there, but then they requested a permit in this largely Latino, Latinx and Black community. But because the permit, there's not this rule that says you have to look at the cumulative effects. They only look at the one permit, forgetting that we've actually had an auto metals reclamation a yard there that has been putting manganese into the air, that this area has been exposed to pet coke, that this area has been has actually some brown fields, and this area, nobody looked at the cumulative effects. That's why I have that requirement in the bill that I put forward. But you are right. This is really when we talk about Black Lives Matter and we talk about civil rights and structural racism in our society, especially after last summer. People think of it in terms of the criminal justice system, but they don't recognize that it exists just within the very structure of things like building code permits and the like. That it is the Black and brown communities that have been the places where we have put our most polluting industries. And even when it's not where we put our most polluting industries, those residents lack the resources to fight those industries when they move into the local area. A related example is ethylene oxide. We have a plant that actually cleans medical devices, and it uses gas, ethylene oxide. There's a plant in a community called Burr Ridge, which is a very wealthy, affluent, largely white neighborhood. And then they were also in Waukegan, Illinois, which is a largely Latinx community. The white community were able to band together, activists, they had the spare time, the resources, and they were able to demand and get EPA monitoring of the air there. But the EPA never put an air monitor in the Latinx community, even though those folks were asking for it as well. Because the EPA had more focus on the white community than they did the brown community. And that Waukegan, actually, the city was actually contemplating taking out a loan so that it could pay for its own air monitoring to protect its own residents. That's structural racism. That's a classic example, and we need to stop that.
With all of the work that you're doing for environmental issues, what kind of environment are you hoping to create for the next generation?
Oh, I mean, I want I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old daughter. I want them to have a better environment than the one that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and the one that we're living in right now. I want a carbon neutral future before they become adults. I want us to get to a place where the environment is something that they can enjoy, and I hope that they will read about environmental pollutions and all of that in history books. And I want it to be available to all, because I want my daughters to experience it, but I also want their friends to have it no matter where they live in this country as well.
Thank you again, Senator Duckworth, for all your time. We'll have to return you back to the business of votes. And thank you again for speaking on all these questions.
Thanks for having me on.
That's it for this episode of Politically Speaking. Be sure to check out STLPR for all the information you need about We Live Here and our political coverage. Both Politically Speaking and We Live Here are productions of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. I'm Jason Rosenbaum, and thank you for listening.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.